pleasure to introduce the team behind the documentary Unapologetic. We have the producer, Morgan Johnson. Say hi, Morgan.
Hey, how you doing, everyone? Thanks for watching.
And we have the director, producer, DP, Ashley O'Shea. Hi,
Hello,
Ashley.
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your film with us, and thank you for being here for this live Q&A. It feels like, I mentioned to you earlier, it feels almost like a continuation of the conversation we had yesterday, because we talked with Jatavia Gary, and she said hello, and we talked about Black women, and we talked about politics, and I think some of the same themes in a very different way are expressed in your film. I'd like to ask, how did this project begin?
Yeah, so this project started in the fall of 2015. I had returned to Chicago after school, and it was around the time that a lot of young Black people were continuing to organize around the police killing of a young Black woman named Rekia Boyd. And it was just a buzz in all of the circles that I was in. And I saw that there was going to be a police board hearing at the Chicago Police Headquarters, which was kind of like a monthly forum for residents to talk to this appointed police board that's kind of over accountability and all the brutality cases and things of that nature. And so once the pomp and circumstance of that whole meeting kind of ended, actually young Black organizers in the space shut the meeting down completely. And it was just so electrifying and energizing. And not only because of what they were doing in the space, but also because the people that were centered in that space were Black women and femmes. And that was just something I had really not seen a lot of in my formal education. And so, yeah, I just started to do a bit of research to see if there was any comprehensive media pieces that was told about, social movements from this specific perspective. And, I came up short, obviously. And I just felt like at the time, Chicago was in a hallmark moment around policing and how young Black people in particular were kind of approaching it in this new and refreshing way. And so that's when I first approached Janae about the project, and everything just kind of snowballed from there.
Ashley always answers that question so eloquently. I think that there's a social uprising happening all over the country, and us as filmmakers, we're always just looking around and being like, what can we do? I don't know about you, Ashley, but I'm really not the type of person where my instinct is like, okay, I'm going to go organize and like put together a rally. But I know that, I shape narratives. I care a lot about, I watch the news and I see how the news is covering things, and I'm looking at the narratives that political pundits are using. And I'm seeing that people on the ground are not having a voice, like the people who need their messaging out there isn't getting as much visibility. So, we as filmmakers, that's when it's our time to step in and do what we can do to take part in this movement that is currently shaping our nation.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. And Morgan and Ashley, how did you two come to pair up for this project? Were you already decided to work on something and then the subject came around, or
well, I met Ashley. I had met Ashley before. We both attended Northwestern, actually, did their film program. So I had met her before. I'm a couple of years older. And then when I moved back to Chicago, she was already in Chicago making this film. And Cartemquin stepped in and kind of put a bug in my ear, because Ashley was going through those networks and as an intern and being in the Diverse Voices in Documentary program. And they were saying, hey, you're back as a producer. We have a project that we think you'll be interested in. And, I had no intention of joining a film at the time, because I had just started my own company, which is a publication called The Tribe here in Chicago, doing journalism work, reshaping the narrative of Black Chicago. So at the same time that I started that company, I jumped in to help with Unapologetic, because Ashley's demo was just, it moved me so much. It moved me enough to write her paragraphs worth of a response in an email. So I got involved. But really, Ashley, again, I'm always amazed that you kind of just went out there and just did it yourself, because there was no funding, there was no team. It was Ashley shooting this film and producing this film for years, even before I got involved.
You always make it sound so noble.
Because it is. You did it by yourself.
I didn't realize I didn't realize Cartemquin was the matchmaker between you two. That's great. We love them so much. And did you both have background working with them, and that's how they knew to match you?
Yeah, so I actually started the film while I was interning at Cartemquin. And I believe Morgan was a previous intern as well and had worked on a few Cartemquin films. Um, and yeah, a big kind of push. Cartemquin helped in a lot of ways to keep me at least feeling motivated to move forward, because like right after I did the internship, I immediately went into their Diverse Voices in Docs Fellowship, which is like a 6-month, crash course in making your first film. So I think that helped me. I mean, I was by myself, but like that community held me accountable in a lot of ways, because I was like, I have to deliver these things month to month. So, that motivated me to keep filming and gathering the stuff that I needed to try to get funding and support the film in a better way.
And were they helpful in you making the transition to be producer, Morgan? It sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. After I graduated Northwestern's film program, I became an intern at Cartemquin, and they were so instrumental in just helping me find my way as a filmmaker in Chicago. And also, after I was an intern, they helped me land a job at 371 Productions in Milwaukee. So it was a very rare case of me going from being an intern and a PA to an associate producer and producer at a production company and jumping right into documentary. So Cartemquin to me is like family. Their institution is so important and valued when it comes to nurturing emerging filmmakers here in Chicago.
And around. They're so, I'm a big admirer of what they do and the people there. So let's go back. So you found Janae, and then you also found Bella. So how did you decide on these two main subjects?
For Janae, Janae was the first person I reached out to, and it was really a cold call. Because at the time, Black Youth Project 100, who she was organizing with, they were a really well-known group in Chicago, in terms of what was happening with the movement. And so she was at the time the co-chair of the Chicago chapter, and I just reached out to her and was like, "Hey, I have this feeling of an idea to tell have this film project told from a Black woman's perspective." And she was just down to do it. She was entering her first year in her PhD program. She was 24 at the time. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, you're 24, you're like a leader in this huge organization, you're starting a PhD program. And I think I saw a lot of myself in her, because I've always kind of been the type to just like take too much of my plate, and be very methodical about everything. And so, part of me, I think, just saw myself in her as well. And then as we like continued filming, shortly after we started filming with Janae, the tape of Laquan McDonald's killing came out. And, a couple days later, they fired the police superintendent here in Chicago. And I went to police headquarters to document the organizers like celebrating this success. And that's where Bella was performing that day. And there's just like this light that's following her in the crowd. And I mean, light not needed. She has a light in herself. She has so much energy, and it's so electrifying. Um, and she's so small, and it was just like a lot of curiosity started to pop up in that moment. And so I started to talk to her, and I found out she's from the west side of Chicago. Um, has this history of incarceration in her family, and I just I felt that it would be a good compliment to Janae, because Janae is not from here, and I really feel like we needed like a native Chicagoan feel to complement the story. So yeah, people often like kind of label them as like fire and ice. I think they balance each other out well.
It's
I'm
so
so
funny.
interested. Oh, go ahead,
No, I just
Morgan.
want to add, because when I first started working on the project with Ashley, she had the idea that she was going to make a film about the movement and like go after filming, I guess like more so of like the landscape of the organizing
Yeah.
scene in Chicago. But then I'm watching her footage and I'm just like, but who's Bella? Like,
Yeah.
she is a character. Okay, so over time, and in the edit room, we started to see the stories shaping around characters rather than cases. Like sometimes these types of films would have followed like, you know, the beginning, middle, and end of the Rekia Boyd case. And this film is very different in that we're looking into the lives of organizers, which I think makes this film very unique.
Yeah, I was really struck by the end where we see Bella performing and we see, you know, the results of the PhD, good, you know, the passing, the dissertation, and then thinking about like the early stuff about like beginning with, I was interested in this interest in like art and in academia as like both complements and like contrast to what they're doing, and how we even have that really striking bit of remembrance of like where going to college meant going to prison, and like that they were away. And you mentioned that fire and ice, but was that interest in art and academia part of that that interest and approach?
Yeah. I think also because while I was filming and just learning more about political organizing in Chicago, I was seeing how all these different fields kind of intersected to support the movement. So, like, even the music in Chicago, there's a very strong musical history here in the city, and that is like absolutely fundamental to the organizing work that people do, and like the spoken word scene and the art scene, because a lot of these spaces help to visualize these more complicated ideas about what it means to get people free. Um, and so I knew that like every time I talk to Janae, it's just like so much insight and so many important things are said. But I know that, you know, if you don't have that academic background, it's hard to like comprehend those ideas sometimes. And so I think that's why it's so important that everybody kind of puts their hand on the movement here in Chicago, because it helps to translate um, what's happening on a social and political level to people that don't always come from the same privileges or educational backgrounds.
I think something else that Bella brings, you know, as an artist in the movement, you know, social and civil rights movements, they have movement songs, and those songs look different today than they do, you know, in the 60s where We Shall Overcome. You know, Bella's lyrically, I like comparing and contrasting, you know, lyrically where the movement is taking us. And also just Bella representing the streets, because, you know, we have Janae who's giving us, you know, very academic perspectives and diagrams and things like that throughout the film. But we also have Bella who's telling us, I learned how to be an organizer from gang members, you know, and we see, you know, a pan of a shot that's like her family, her community. And that is a form of organizing that she respects and that that is her lineage. So yeah, that's another important perspective, where it's like these social movements, we have to meet people where they are. And for Bella, that's like the West Side at a park, you know, a community gathering, and giving back to community in that way.
Actually, well, both of you, was it always the intention to do just sort of, I'm going to probably misuse the phrase because I know there are fine differences, but like direct cinema, just, you know, as opposed to doing interviews of just, were you just always wanting to capture them in their worlds rather than do interviews?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think part of the coming up in the Cartemquin tradition is it's very steeped in cinema verite. So like, I didn't really see. That's how I was trained in the documentary space. And honestly, one of the first films I watched that encouraged me to be a documentary filmmaker was The Interrupters by Steve James. Like I saw it while I was in college and didn't. I don't know if I had seen a lot of documentaries at that point, but I was just enamored how you can take so much and glean so many lessons from just observing people's like day-to-day life. And I just never really was a fan of kind of like the talking head, like expert kind of composed documentaries, although I see the place for those, but I just felt like part of the reason that I wanted to make the film was because I saw so much richness and community in my reality, in my day-to-day. And I think that is like what was missing in the media space. Like we just see protesters, they're portrayed as like this monolith or like this like block. And we only see them in the political space. But I was like, I have seen Black women at home and in like at barbecues and in all these other places that I know are so important to my community. And so I just really wanted to reflect that in this film because the protest doesn't exist without the birthday party. You know what I mean? Like people need that refuel and that space and that energy. Sorry, there's like 7 dogs barking outside. They, they need all of that energy to be able to come back into the space and continue to organize.
There's so many stereotypes about Black Lives Matter organizers. They're kind of like this mythical, they've taken on their own meaning, you know, the term Black Lives Matter, depending on who is shaping the narrative. So, you know, sometimes I watch political pundits or whatever say like these kids don't have jobs or they're outside agitators or they're this or they're that. Yeah. And I'm so glad that this film just says like, no, they're actually just young people who live in this community and are actually civically engaged, because there's so much of a disconnect with these narratives where we're often judging young people and telling them like, you're not voting enough, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. But this film is showing you that they're showing up to community meetings. They're holding public officials accountable. They are educated and engaged. So we need to have a deeper conversation about young people and their place in this movement. And we need to also recognize that they're people who actually live this work and are affected by the policies that govern our country.
Great. I wanted to ask you about, was it a deliberate decision to have a mostly the main crew be Black? Like there's you two, and I noticed that there's, yeah, you're like, go ahead, Ashley. There's also an editor,
no,
man, right? You're like, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I think part of my just as I was going through this process, and maybe it's because the first year I was mostly just working by myself. I just have real faith in young Black creatives that they can achieve major things, and I kind of did it to prove a point because there's so much in the media space about like, you know, what experience people are bringing and if people can get a job done. And that's just something that I knew could happen from the creatives that I had talked to in the Chicago space. And I also feel like, you know, although white filmmakers have made some beautiful films in the documentary landscape, that perspective really matters. Like the energy that you're bringing behind the lens affects what you see in front of it. no matter how, ethical or well-rounded an outsider may try to be. And so I wanted this film to feel like it was made by young Black people because the film is about young Black people. And I knew that there's just an energy and an excitement there that could not be captured as well, from another, from another perspective. And yeah, I just wanted to see if it would work, and it did. And that's not to say we didn't have, white people help on the film or more men and things of that nature, but we really prioritize, young Black creatives in the space to really try to push home this idea that we have everything that we need.
Great. Anything to say on that, Morgan?
Well, there's a lot to be said about. It's like, where do we start? I mean, there are a lot of films that are extractive. I mean, media is extractive, journalism is extractive, documentary is extractive. And what I mean is that we're going into a community with our camera and we're telling, many times Black people or people who have experienced trauma, like, give me something and I'm giving you nothing in return. Or like, what you get in return is me getting to tell your story. And they may or may not see a benefit in that. So I think with us making the decision to make this a film by Black women is that we're active community members. Ashley and I were attending Bella's shows and attending rallies without cameras, and just being a part of community so that when we came around, it wasn't only because we were there to take something. So I think that really makes a difference when it comes to gaining access, but also just being like a good human being and realizing that this is a very tense and emotional time for our community, and especially Black Chicago, which is often at the center of narratives dealing with so-called Black on Black crime and all types of different things. So I think it's helpful that we're already known in the space and have an interest, and we're in the community, and we're also like, we live here and we're invested in the community long term.
Great. I wanted to ask about some of the really, I think, revelatory, kind of juicy bits about talking about dating and how hard it is to be a heterosexual feminist. That part was so vulnerable and true and not shown enough. Was that a surprise for you, or was that something you would hope would come out, that conversation?
I don't think it was a surprise necessarily. I think what Bella is articulating in that moment is a consideration that a lot of straight women have, myself included. And and I think all of that plays into the larger, like, what this movement is trying to achieve by centering Black queer feminism. Like, it's a matter of breaking down systems that they aren't only harmful, in our workspaces, in our communities, it can be harmful in our homes as well, when it comes to, across genders. And I think that's a consideration in recent years a lot of women have made, because although we can see a lot of progress, in terms of the larger movement, that's not always what we're seeing in our day to day, or even when you're talking to a man and what his beliefs are and how he feels about women, or about Black queer women leading a movement. There's been a lot of pushback. I'm making that sound like it was not a lot, but like, I've had experiences of showing the film to groups of Black men where they don't understand. They're like, where are the men? Or they're just like, they don't understand why they can't be centered in the conversation. And I think that's just because patriarchy, it affects minority communities as well. But that's the message, it's like, we're trying to not only break the system of racism, but the systems of patriarchy that, plague us on a day-to-day basis as women and, trans folks and beyond.
Anything to say on that, Morgan?
Um, I mean, patriarchy is everywhere and it's in the Black community. So, in our churches, in our homes. So, this film has helped me had conversations like with my own family, with my father about how he views, feminism. Because you have me, I'm his young business owning daughter, and it's just like my dad's a pastor, and we have conversations about like, okay, so if the man is the head of the household, is there less God in me than a man? And you have to like have those conversations. Now is the time. Like that's what this movement is doing. It's just like, if we're saying all Black lives matter, do we really mean all Black lives matter? Or are we really gonna rank and be like, okay, Black men and then Black women and then Black, like what are we really saying here? So I think this film is a good educational tool as a springboard of those conversations where the Black community can really just interrogate ourselves and say like, what systems do we need to break down internally as a family?
I want to ask too about how your well, you mentioned that like there have been some pushback from Black men. Have there been some necessary self-criticism? Have there been some, do you feel like some men who are watching the film are also getting the message and kind of having some self-interrogation? I think you just said that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to gauge in the virtual space because, you know,
Yeah.
people watch the film at all different times, and, whether or not they get feedback is definitely up in the air. But like Morgan said, I think if anything, it's 86 minutes where a man has to sit and watch a film where men are being centered, and I feel like that is a radical act in itself. Um,
This
and
film was very
yeah,
kind to men. I'm gonna say this film was kind to men.
yeah, I mean,
Really wanted to. All right.
yeah, I mean, we did try to go
You
harder, but
held
it was
back.
just not enough
Yeah,
time. Yeah.
It's not
I'm
enough
sure.
time. And there is a history of sexism, abuse, um, sexual assault, all kinds of things happening within these movements where we're supposed to be fighting for Black liberation. And we do it by propping up men and stepping on and abusing Black women. So we could have like really went down there, but it's hard to get access to those conversations. So and we can
Yeah,
make
I
a
mean,
whole
it warrants a film in itself. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's crazy though, like the Panthers, that stuff didn't get revealed. I feel like it was just secret for so long and then started kind of getting revealed about how bad it was. It's good to talk about as it's happening. What about you? Do you think that working on this film changed your politics in any way? Both of you? Each of you?
Yes.
How so?
I mean, before I had started this film, I didn't. I think my relationship to Blackness was a little bit different. I've always been surrounded by Blackness in my life and in Black community and Black family. Um, but there was a lot of unlearning that I went through over the process of this film. I mean, one just literally being this idea of a Black queer feminist lens. I was just like, what does that even mean? Um, and even like queerness in itself, a big thing I talked to Janae about is that queerness can be a sexuality, but it's also a politic. You don't necessarily need to identify sexuality wise as queer to be queer in your politics. Queer is, as her mom says, it's anything that's different or deviant from the norm, and that's why people are uplifting it so much because a queer politic can mean abolishing the police because that's so deviant from what our norms are. And I think it also pushed this idea that I started to learn about in college about this idea of intersectionality, and how people exist at the intersection of their identities. So, I'm not just Black, I'm not just a woman, I'm a Black woman, middle class. Like all of those inform how I make a decision about something. And that's something I think is really really present as well in the movement for Black Lives in Chicago, is that people are they're building ideas and strategies based on this idea of intersectionality. And I don't have to come to a rally or event and only be a Black person. I can be everything that I am, and that can be impactful.
Great. Morgan, what about you? Did it change your politics working on this?
That was so good. I think that the film covers kind of like the seeds, the beginning of the abolitionist movement that we're seeing now at the forefront of the movement for Black lives. And I think that I had a lot to learn in terms of abolition because I just had never heard of it in this context before. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like they taught me so much, just in general. I'm just going to say that they taught me a lot. The movement for Black Lives has taught me a lot because they really created the progressive frameworks that politicians are running on and lying about now all over the country. And so those things, those policies were being spoken of while we were creating this film. And it was the first time that I was hearing about these policies. So yeah, this whole thing was a learning experience, and I came out on the other end, I think, smarter, just like more smarter about politics and smarter about policy, because we got
and local politics.
And local
I
politics.
just feel like
the intricacies of what goes on in Chicago. I mean, yeah, I learned so much from just sharing space with these young organizers.
That's great. I want to ask you, okay, now I'm going to go for some trickier questions again, or a tricky issue. The film ends with the knowledge that Anita Alvarez ends up being ousted, and we hear and we see that Lori Lightfoot, a Black woman, a Democrat, is elected mayor. I think when she was elected mayor, there was a lot of, among people who are looking at representation, a lot of positivity. But as you mentioned, she had been on the board of the police and has not necessarily, even though she is a Black woman, this is about Black women, has not necessarily been, this hasn't been a good thing. And or all around it. So I just want to know if you can talk, these are both women of color. So can we talk a little bit about that, this idea of like representation and how tricky that can be and how counterproductive that can be for real.
How much time you got? No, I'm kidding.
Floor's yours.
Yeah, it's just whenever people say Lori Lightfoot, I feel like a fire turns on in me, and it's a lot. But something I talk about a lot is in the film, as you said, we see the police superintendent get fired, we see the state's attorney get ousted, we see that Mayor Rahm Emanuel does not run for re-election, and in all three of those positions, Black people initially replaced them. So Kim Foxx, the state's attorney now, Eddie Johnson as the police superintendent, Lori Lightfoot as the mayor, and I think that just the results that we're seeing now of Lori Lightfoot's administration. It just came out last week that Eddie Johnson like sexually assaulted a Black woman for years on the force. Kim Foxx is doing okay, but anyway, in general, like everything that we're seeing now just goes to show that it's less of an individual problem than it is an institutional issue. Like Black faces in the highest places don't mean anything if the institution is still corrupt. And so I think, although Lori is definitely culpable for a lot of what we're seeing right now about, the city budget and policing and the brutality that happened over the summer, she's also coming from she's in a city where the police get $40 million a day to operate. She was appointed to Rahm's task force and was a huge part in deciding how the police were supposed to reform, and then they ignored like most of those most of those reforms. And so that, what does representation mean then? You know what I mean? And as I said, I think she's culpable for a lot of things, but I also think she has a lot of people telling her what to do. She has the fraternal order of the police to answer to, which is not like, it's a gang. And honestly, like, it's literally something that you should fear, to be quite honest, because of how they defend police that kill, young Black and brown people. And so I think that's why seeing what these organizers did at that time is so important, because they're not trying to necessarily hold these people accountable. They're trying, while they're doing that, they're trying to show how these institutions are problematic and like the steps that we can take so that they are not so oppressive to the Black and brown citizens of the city.
And to be clear, these young organizers who were protesting in the police board hearings tried to tell the city of Chicago, do not vote for Lori Lightfoot. We don't trust her. She is a cop. She does not have our best interests in heart. And white liberals just could not see that, did not listen, and put her in power, and are pretty much, some of them, in shock of the way that she is ignoring the voices of the people. For instance, there's been surveys in the city where 87% of the city who participated has said we want to reallocate funds from the police to more life-giving institutions like education and healthcare. She flat out ignores it. She flat out says, Chicago is the only major city that has not really listened to or adhered to any of the demands of the movement for Black lives. She will not.
She said that she would defund the uniforms.
she won't buy new uniforms for the cops. That's kind of like what the city of Chicago got. But she's keeping police in school. She's not listening. She's not interested, and she makes that very clear. So this is a case where young people were more engaged than the majority of the city, or like progressives who put Lori Lightfoot in office. And it just shows that we have to go beyond representative politics and really be engaged to get to know these people before we put them into power.
You see some of the same things play out in the film world, with people saying, no, that's not the right person to represent us. And often it's exactly the people that the individual, it's the individuals who white liberals choose to be in this sort of tokenized high places, but it's also, I think, as you guys know, the systemic role of being a token and being within, I think it's bold.
And maybe Lori Lightfoot is carrying out the agenda of, white liberals. As far as we're concerned, her interests have been, with preserving the ruling class, and preserving like downtown Chicago and corporations and things like that. So yeah, it's been a struggle here. This was a rough summer here in Chicago of uprisings. Yeah.
Well, I think it's been a rough summer around the country and the world. I think it's been, but it's really good to hear. I thank you again for so much for making, a view that feels like an insider view rather than an outsider view of what's happening in Chicago. It's so necessary. We're going to go to questions. So if you're watching on Eventive or YouTube, please go ahead and you can put your question in the comments and they'll get to us. While we're waiting for comments to come in, Morgan, can I ask you about, can you tell us a little bit more about Tribe, the publication that you do?
Oh, sure. So I'm co-founder of the Tribe. We're a publication and production company that is reshaping the narrative of Black Chicago. That is thetribewith2eyes.com. We started in 2017, like I said, around the time that I joined Unapologetic. And it really was a result of feeling like Chicago was the center of so many narratives around Black America. It seems like so many people, whenever they want to just bash Black people, they're just like, well, what about what's happening in Chicago? So like Black Chicagoans were like, okay, wait a minute. Wait a minute, why is it always us? Why do you always have something to say about us? And why don't Black people have a say in our own narrative, especially when Chicago is the home to so many political movements, to so many artistic movements, and so many other things. Why is it that the dominant narrative of Chicago, Black on Black crime, it's just not a honest representation of who we are? So, kind of took matters in my own hands. And now I'm a publisher. I never thought I would be that. But yeah, I'm a publisher, and we're a regular publication that tells news, and it's authored by mostly Black Chicagoans. So it's a learning experience, but one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. So check out thetribe.com and learn about the real Black Chicago.
Thank you. I will. I'm sure our viewers will too. I want to ask, what you just said reminded me, you can totally not answer this question because you probably shouldn't, but I am very curious what your thoughts are specifically on the gender issues in Spike Lee's Chirac.
Oh.
I thought you were about to ask about the election, and I was like, where's it going?
I just want to say that Chirac raised so much money from foundations who did not give Unapologetic money. So that's what I'll say about Chirac, is that why did foundations feel the need to give Spike Lee funding about a fiction film about Chicago with this framework, and they didn't give funding to a film about movement workers in Chicago centering Black women? So that's what I'll say about that.
Diplomatic, perfect answer.
I couldn't even tell you, honestly, because I think I watched it one time and then I never watched it again.
I'm not even no, I think I finished it. It's a bad topic.
It feels like a film made about Chicago by somebody not from Chicago, honestly. Because
we resist the name Chirac. Like, yeah, it was a term with like young kids in drill music for a little bit, but most of us were like, no, we're not gonna call Chicago Chirac. Like, that's not us. So
yeah,
it's not something we wanted to like elevate. Yeah.
That's fair enough. And a really good point about the foundations. Again, that's something that I think you see replicated a lot. Here's a question from someone who would like to hear Ashley about filming everything yourself, about specifically about navigating protest spaces with your camera. Can you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, while me filming myself was kind of just like a happy accident or a necessity in the beginning, it's something that I continued to do all the way through the end of production because I felt like it allowed me to achieve an intimacy with the characters that, it's kind of like the more people you have, the harder it is to like get to that intimacy. And when it came to protests in particular, it really helped me to maneuver the space a lot easier because you're for the most part in a large crowd, you're walking long distances, and although I get a lot of questions about like if I was fearful in those spaces, especially when there was like a police presence, and not knowing exactly how they would respond to protesters. But I think one, like I knew I had a tie to the community, and a lot of times when people are going into strategic direct action, they have an emergency plan for if the police get violent or if people get arrested. And they have a plan to just look out for each other. The night of the Laquan McDonald protest, young Black people de-arrested like a lot of people, and stopped people from, although people ended up in police custody, they stopped a lot of people from ending up in police custody. And then also my camera, I think I don't know as much with this summer because I think the brutality kind of reached a new level, but at the time I really felt like it was a shield between me and the police, and gave a sort of legitimacy, even though I wasn't with a major publication or news station or anything like that. Um, but it's almost like I see you, you know what I mean? It's like one thing for me to just see you person to person, but if I have a camera and it's pointed in your face, you don't wanna look stupid, especially if we're here protesting about somebody who's been brutalized by the police. So I think that gave me a lot of courage, and I just always tried to think about, how it was gonna be portrayed in the final edit. And I kind of just like enter the space of the camera. I kind of like disembody completely, because if I get too much of my feelings and emotions, it's gonna stop me from getting the shots that I want to.
Great. Um, so there's no more questions. So this is your last chance for a question, but I have one more question. A lot of the things that you're saying are just resonating so much about, we do a lot of work in Indie Memphis about for specifically about like uplifting Black filmmakers, and especially women of color and Black women filmmakers. And a lot of what you're saying resonates within the difficulties of being a woman of color, especially a Black woman in the film industry too. And I wonder if if I know this year the abolition movement has totally changed my view of so many things. And I wonder if you think that, are there ways that Black Lives Matter and abolition movement that you think that the film industry can learn from to make progress?
I don't quite understand your question.
Just that, like, well, that are the way that the activists that you've seen, the movements they have, the collaboration, the re-envisioning of the abolition movement, are there ways that there's progress being made within those movements that you think that the film industry could adopt to make changes in some way? That there's places where the film industry is just, it's not the same issue, but there's lack of progress and barriers and gangs and low key, not as active, not as absolutely gangs, but it's okay. It's a broad question, but again, I found that the abolition movement really inspiring.
We can talk about social justice like within the filmmaking industry.
Sure.
I feel like working on this film did cause me to interrogate a little more ideas around, again, extraction documentary, going into mostly Black and Brown communities and filming when people are going through hard times, and thinking about like who should be telling these stories and when we should tell these stories. I think that there needs to be some more education and media literacy around documentary, because especially throughout the movement for Black lives, we're in the midst of a fight around Breonna Taylor, right? And we see a Netflix film come out like right now during this time. And usually, like, at least my social media feed is exploding with like, look at documentary filmmakers making money off of this story. Like, we are currently being traumatized. So like, I guess because documentary and technology has changed, it feels like these films are happening more immediate rather than like we're looking back on a time. So I'm thinking about that. Like, is it the right time right now during Breonna Taylor for us to have a film about Breonna Taylor on Netflix? Is it the right time when we're currently seeing journalism happening around Breonna Taylor? Like the story is still playing out, and people are kind of getting re-traumatized by the stories that we tell. So I think with this film, we were very, very calculated in the way that we did not want this film to re-traumatize people. We did not want to show the Laquan McDonald shooting. You know, it's available, it's online, but we don't need to show people what it looks like for a Black person to be shot, you know. So we're thinking about the audience experience, and we're thinking about, you know, the film itself being like a healing space rather than a re-traumatizing space. So that is one thing that we were thinking about.
That's great. What about you, Ashley? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about the changing of hands that kind of has to occur in the documentary film space for a film to even be completed. Um, and I think in large part my film was able to be completed because I had a lot of institutional backing and but I was also in a place where I had the educational background and the skills to be able to get that support. Um, and although I'm very grateful for all of that, I think that there's a lot of people who I see a lot of other filmmakers struggling to finish their films because they weren't invited to these spaces to be able to perfect their pitch or perfect their grant app, or perfect their demo, and they just don't know the steps that they need to take. And throughout the process, I just felt like I was constantly being spoon fed this like very specific pathway on how to fund your film, and people be like, "Oh, you're not paying X amount of money to your editor. Like he's just working in kind for this long. Like what's wrong with him?" Like stuff like that was just always kind of jarring to me, because, like Morgan said, we were just really trying. We were trying to be ethical as well behind the camera, and so I was always working to try to make sure I wasn't taking advantage of people. Um, but unfortunately, I feel like that's a narrative that is perpetuated because we're still in this like capitalistic climb and succeed achievement first type system in filmmaking. And that makes me wonder just how many voices are being left out because they didn't go to Northwestern, or they didn't go to Cartemplin, or they didn't even get admitted to either place. Um, because, like I said, like even the young team behind this film, I knew had such a fresh and cool perspective. But like, what would this film have looked like if it was like a really young Black person from the West Side making it, from Chicago's West Side? You know, it would have looked completely different. But that just because they don't have the same kind of makeup as I do doesn't mean that it's any less worthy, or it wouldn't be as resonant as it is.
That's a great answer. And yeah, a really important issue. I think that I think we'll wrap here. I want to thank you again both so much for joining us and for sharing your film with us in Memphis and around the country for this screening. And I think it'll mean a lot, especially I think it'll mean a lot to those in Memphis and everyone else watching it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. And we'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. with Elegance Breton, the director of Peer Kids. And we'll see you then. Thanks again to Morgan and Ashley. Bye.